Hi all. I wanted to talk to you today about William Dean Howells and Realism, and we are talking about him this week as well as the short story he wrote called Editha. So first of all, who was William Dean Howells? He was an author and a critic. He championed literary realism, and he also became close friends with Mark Twain and Henry James, both of who wrote in the realist style. Now it's interesting to see the things that Howells stood for. He actively participated in different movements, anti-slavery, racial equality, and the equality of women. He also was against class division and exploitation. So you can see he was forward thinking for his time, and he tried to expose a lot of these injustices through his writing. He became the main editor for the Atlantic Monthly, and this was a literary and cultural commentary magazine. Eventually, it achieved national recognition, and it was very important to the careers of many American writers and poets. It showcased their work. It's still around today. It's known as The Atlantic, but this magazine started in the 1800s, and it has endured over time. So when Howells was editor of this, he was known as the Dean of American Letters. I'm sure this is a play on his middle name, Dean, as well. So he was, during this time, writing in the realist style, but he was also arguing that they needed more authors writing in this style, and he wanted to print them in the magazine. So let's just look at literary realism real quick. We've been reviewing that this week. This started in the mid-19th century, and it was a response to Romanticism. So it was seeking to portray life objectively with the attention to fact and detail. It was also during a time when psychology was, for the first time, getting recognition as a bona fide field of study. It used to be looked at as quackery, and suddenly people were realizing that it was legitimate, and so literary realist works often delved into the workings of the human psyche, how the mind works, and the thought processes that people had around certain events and problems. And realism also often used a journalistic style, but it was not very popular at first, and maybe some people never liked it. The literate society, and you have to remember that literate society were the elite, more wealthy class. Many of the working class and lower class did not know how to read. So reading was often reserved for the more elite class, and they saw realist writing as common, indecent, vulgar, a betrayal of the ideal of fine literature. They had this idea that art should protect itself from common life, just as the people, the wealthy people, tried to protect themselves from lower classes. They would even make sure their neighborhood roads didn't pass by the lower class neighborhoods, so they didn't have to view how other people lived, because it was that repulsive to them that they didn't want to know this. They thought literature instead should concern itself with ideal characters, pure thoughts, noble emotions. And realist literature sought to turn this on its head. And it really wanted to show people what life was really like. If you look at the art during this time period, if you look, say, at romantic art versus realist art, in romantic art you have this kind of idealized pictures, versions of reality, based on imagination and nature. And in realist paintings, you have perhaps the nitty-gritty details of a battlefield at war, people lying on the field, bleeding or dead. That's kind of the shift between these two thought processes, and this is making its way into literature. So next, let's look at some of Howell's words about realism. He said that the realist novel is made for the benefit of people who have no true use of their eyes. So again, he's addressing, I think, this literate class of people who don't want to look at reality. So he wants to educate them into that reality. And through writing, Howells, as did Twain, is trying to make the wrongs of society obvious rather than preaching against them, they're writing about them and trying to change the world that way. So Howell said, writing should be simple, natural, and honest, and should not delve into romantic exaggeration. He also said, realism is nothing more and nothing less than the truthful treatment of material. So he really wanted that honesty, that honest portrayal of human life in literature. So Howells and Twain met up after Twain published Innocents Abroad, and Howells gave it a positive review, and Twain traveled to meet him, and Howells and him struck up a friendship. Howells became a mentor to Twain after that, and he advised him even about his work in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. And this was a book that really opened the door for realist writing in mainstream literature. It was also the emergence of Huckleberry Finn that established Twain as the pillar of realism. This book was actually started before The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, but this first-person narrative of an orphan boy and a runaway slave had a profound effect on the future of American literature. Twain showed the moral decrepitude of slavery and racism in vivid color in that book. And he didn't do it by preaching. He was just portraying the world as it really was. And this was the essence of realism. Of course, Twain had some regionalism that he wrapped in there as well, but he was really trying to portray life as it truly existed and to educate people too about some of these realities that people would rather not face. So now let's look at Editha, and this is a short story that Howells wrote. And the story really delves into a lot of issues that were important to Howells through his career as a writer, as a political activist as well. And it's an anti-war piece set against the backdrop of the Spanish-American War. And what Howells sets out to do in this story is to show the differences between romanticism versus realism. So he's trying to show that realism is not only a better, more accurate representation of the world, but also a more ethical one. So in this story, Editha represents romanticism, and George and George's mother represent realism. So Editha, she's the romantic. She's consumed with this idea of the hero. And George is going to go to war and be the hero and fulfill this role, and she's going to be so proud of her fiancé, future husband in this role. She doesn't think about the consequences, the actual realities of war, what might happen to him, that he could even die. Instead, she just thinks about all the idealized romantic pictures that war brings to her mind, and she lets her imagination really reign with these ideas. So this is kind of how romantics tended to approach things, using imagination to constitute their reality. And here's a couple phrases that Editha says. I'm yours for time and eternity, time and eternity. And he was very nearly perfect as he was, and he must be allowed to perfect himself. So she kind of has this idealized worldview that's not looking at the reality of things. And then you have George. He's the realist, and he represents that view with a tinge of sarcasm. So he says, I'm going to the war, the big war, the glorious war, the holy war, ordained by the pocked providence that blesses butchery. So he's got this sarcastic tinge to his words. Pocked is a reference to smallpox. Providence is a reference to the divine. So he's talking about how the divine is diseased because the divine is supposed to be blessing war that represents butchering other human beings, and he does not agree with it. So he is a realist. He also has a lot of mixed emotions about going to war. He wants to please his fiancée because she wants him to go, but he really doesn't agree with it. And then his mother, she also makes anti-war comments. She's lived through a war before. She knows the realities of it, and she represents realism in this way. The other thing I want you to pay attention to in the story is yellow journalism. So first of all, yellow journalism is a type of journalism that presents news that is not well researched. So you can think of like the Inquirer magazine or some of those types of magazines that just have eye-catching headlines to sell more newspapers, but they're not necessarily based on facts. They might exaggerate, use sensationalism, those types of things to draw readers in. And at the time, yellow journalism drummed up support for the war. So Howells is comparing yellow journalism in this story to Romanticism. Again, he does not like the idea of Romanticism. So yellow journalism glosses over facts and focuses on sensationalism, appealing to readers' emotions. So in the same way, he's saying Romanticism values emotion and the sensational picture of things over reality. So I'd like you to look for these contrasts as you go through the story. In what ways is Howells representing characters using Romanticism to represent them, or using realism to represent them, and how does he get these ideas across? So I look forward to your comments, and we'll see you soon.